Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Mr. Paul Louden.
First, thank you, Neil, so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to do my best to live up to it. For everyone out there, I am 33 years old, and I was diagnosed with autism about 11 years ago. That means I got through school, 3 failed attempts at college, different attempts at employment, before we really realized something wasn't entirely right. I had diagnoses of ADHD, depression, things like that beforehand, but it wasn't until the autism diagnosis that I finally had the tools necessary to really start improving my situation. With that diagnosis, I began working on understanding who I really am, and I realized that the world didn't work the way I expected it to. Now, autism is a large and complicated diagnosis. It's something that we diagnose by way of a series of symptoms. There's no brain scan or blood test that can tell you whether or not someone has autism. We do know that you can spot signs of it on functional MRI scans, but it's not useful as a diagnostic criteria, not yet at least. So for years, autism was treated by treating the symptoms, by saying, okay, we need to help you develop these skills that can allow you to integrate with the people around you. One of the most common of those is eye contact. Autistic people were known for having social challenges with body language, tone of voice, and eye contact. And it's so common that one of the goals is to teach an autistic person to make eye contact in social situations. For those of you who may be hiring someone, you may notice that, whether or not someone meets you and looks you in the eye plays a big factor into how you feel about them. A lot of parts of employment are social. One of the things about eye contact, though, is that for those of you out there who aren't autistic, the person failing to make eye contact or regularly breaking it may feel uncomfortable. Often, the autistic person will feel uncomfortable when eye contact is maintained. That's why they're not keeping it. And when I talk to people about that, I often find they're surprised to think that, this idea of teaching an autistic person to do the same things a non-autistic person does could result in more stress for the autistic people in exchange for reducing stress for the people around them. You're sitting here, and I tell them, that idea of asking an autistic person to that is to look at those out there in the wheelchairs and say, hey, you know what? We're going to build steeper stairs for you guys. Your arms will get the workout and everything else will be easier. It's just not a solution. So I've spent time thinking about, what do I really want and what can I ask for from people? Because, the truth is that it's hard for me as an autistic person to know what the difference is. I'm autistic, the people around me aren't. They want to know what's inside my mind, but I need to know what's inside their mind to talk about what's different. I've only ever lived as an autistic person. I don't know what life is like for a neurotypical person. So I started, taking time to study the people around me, to try to understand what's going on. And, I learned that a lot of it is issues of communication, that, there are parts of autism that I qualify as a disability, unquestionably. I know that, there's a lot of anger in the autism community, and particularly in the people who had a diagnosis of Asperger's, about the idea that we're being expected to change and conform to society around us. This shows up in the neurodiversity movement a lot, that the idea is autism, changes who we are. It's developmental, and after a certain point, it becomes core to who we are. It's part of how our personality is developed. It's part of how our desires for life around us developed. And you can see similar things in parts of, say, the deaf community. There are people who are culturally deaf, families who have raised their children into what it means to live deaf and to be that and to have pride in that heritage. But there are also parts of autism that are unquestionably a disability, that prevent us from living the lives we want to live. And I tell people, to me, what makes something a disability in my context is things that impede the opportunity for you to live the life that you want to lead. So parts of it, you may embrace them. Parts of it you may see as a stumbling block. And you need the people who are supporting you around you to help you get past the hard parts, but accept the parts that you see as yourself. So we're at a business conference. This is the Usbln. And many of you out there are thinking about, how do we incorporate diversity in the workplace? And especially with autism, this is something that is just now becoming sort of a big deal. For the last, 20, 30 years, we've been learning more and more about autism. It's sort of a relatively new diagnosis, and especially our current understanding of it is very new. They just updated the description and the definition of it in the DSM-5, which streamlined the diagnosis, integrating a lot of what we previously defined as Asperger's as being core to autism. And with that new diagnosis and with our new understanding of what it looks like and how it can present, we've got a diagnosis rate greater than 1 in 100 in children. Some say as high as 1 in 60. That's between 1% and 2% of the people you may be considering for employment in the next 10 or 20 years. That's a lot of people. And that's a lot of people who are going to need jobs and want jobs. Those of us with autism, we're often seen as not as emotional, a bit robotic, a bit stiff, but underneath, we're still people. And that's one thing that can end up overlooked a lot when we try to go out and integrate in the world. We're seen as having this disability, and people often dismiss our personhood when dismissing this disability. When we talk about wanting something or thinking something. If I tell someone my political beliefs, they will say, oh, do you have those beliefs because you're autistic, because you can't understand the whole political situation? When someone has a kid who's autistic and he says, I'm not interested in dating yet, they say, well, you're socially impaired, so maybe if we can make you interested in dating, that'll improve your social situation. It's a mess. And I don't fault any parents for this or anything like that, because I can't tell you what to do to help me. We're all working our way through it together. It's a challenging situation. But as employers, you're put in a situation where you may have people who are autistic applying for jobs. You may or may not know whether they're autistic. When you do know whether they're autistic, they may or may not be the standard employee that you're used to seeing. I know that, Neil came up here and he gave this wonderful description of everything I've ever done. If I'd come up here and told you who I was, I would have said, hi, my name is Paul Louden. I was diagnosed with autism, and I talk about it. I might have mentioned my radio show. I would not have mentioned that I've been doing it for years, or that I'm working on a book, or anything like that. It wouldn't have even occurred to me. I cannot self-promote, because I don't even see that part of myself most of the time. It's very difficult. I have to have notes to remind me of these sorts of things. I'm lucky enough, I have fantastic parents who've been behind me in all of this, and I'm lucky enough to have my mom here who serves the vital purpose of remembering that I have cards that I can give to people, because I don't. So when you're looking to employ autistic people, the situation can look very different. And unfortunately, like I said, some of them, you won't know they're autistic. And when that happens, unfortunately, there's very little you can do. Because when someone shows up and they're a mid to high functioning autistic, and they don't reveal it, then all you're seeing is someone who's behaving in possibly antisocial ways, who doesn't look like a good employment candidate. And people always ask me, Paul, when do you reveal that you're autistic? Well, me, I've already done it. If you Google my name on the internet, you will find me, and you will see that I'm autistic. It may make the dating scene a little difficult, but it's a choice I made to make things better for everyone else. But with other people, I tell them, look, if I met someone now who didn't know I was autistic, and it was a social situation, I want them to know who I am first. I don't want to tell them in advance that I'm autistic. But in an employment situation, I would very much want them to know in advance, because I'm a strong self-advocate. I will ask for things. I will say to my employer, look, I have sound filtration issues. This means that, again, Neil mentioned I've never had a professional job, so I'm going to talk about my job at Pizza Hut very briefly. I delivered pizzas, which was the best job ever because most of the time I didn't have to deal with people, and when I did have to deal with people, I had strict rules for what to do. If they're upset, offer them the pizza for free, and then come back and tell me you did that. That's it. But when I answered phones, it was more challenging. And everyone at the Pizza Hut thought I was at least half deaf because the first thing I would do if I was working phones was turn the volume up as high as it went. But it wasn't because I couldn't hear the phone. It was because I could hear the oven, the people talking in the kitchen, the people talking at dispatch, and everyone else. And I couldn't separate those noises. And so I can go to an employer and say, hey, I can do my work, but is it okay if I wear headphones until someone needs me, even if there's nothing playing, even if there's noise canceling, just so that I can filter out the background noise and focus on what I need to be focusing on? This is the advantage of being upfront about your diagnosis. And it's one of those things where, unfortunately, a lot of us on the spectrum aren't, and a lot of us on the spectrum also haven't yet learned what our challenges are. We know that we have difficulties. I'm fortunate enough to know a few of my sensory difficulties and a few of my social difficulties, but a lot of us on the spectrum, we aren't there yet, and it takes time. But part of that taking time is being employed and finding out what goes wrong. You can't learn how to fit in an office environment until an office environment is willing to give you a job and help you work through that. So we know that diversity is important in the office. We know that, there have been studies from MIT and other places that have shown that increasing the diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, background, increases the profitability and the efficiency of a workplace. There's very little reason to doubt that wouldn't extend to neurodiversity, to including people who have our kind of disabilities into a workplace and seeing, what we can offer in terms of new perspectives on what we're doing, how we can make what we're doing more accessible to people like us, what ways we can market our products or otherwise make our products interesting to people like us, or just, have those different points of view. The problem is, how do you figure out how to incorporate someone like me? Most of the time, you don't have someone who's an expert on it. Even the experts on it tend to be experts on the symptoms of autism, which are very different from the practicalities of incorporating and working with someone. You're not going to want to train them to eye contact in the office. That's partly not important to what your job is, and partly it's just sort of pointless anyway. You're going to want to figure out how to incorporate them with your workers, incorporate them with your office environment. And what I want to tell you is that almost every company in this room probably already has the tools to begin doing this. Because almost every company in this room has some degree of international presence. Working with people with autism means listening to them, means learning what's different for how they work versus how you work. Many of you in here have opened offices in other countries. You've gone to, say, Japan or India or somewhere in Europe, one of the Nordic countries, and you've learned that they have different sorts of work culture and work environment. That, in Japan, there's a very strict hierarchy of people. You don't necessarily make the kind of eye contact you make here because there's a culture of submissiveness to an employee, to an employer, and so on. And you know that when you open up an office in one of these other countries, you can't just say, okay, you're going to have our office culture now, because that's not going to work. You're expecting them to suddenly change everything about how they've learned to work, how they've learned to exist within an office environment. On the other hand, you can't just completely go to their culture, because their culture will not be efficiently integrated with your own office culture and your own techniques for assigning jobs, work management, and everything like that. But what you do is you look at what's there and what you have, and you integrate them. You listen to the people, ideally the people who are currently working, a different way, and you say, okay, what parts of this can we allow to continue? What parts of this need to be changed to fit our work environment? And the first step, as I said, is listening. An autistic person may not know why they need something or even what they need, but they may be able to say, I can't do that. And that's a starting point for someone who's curious and really desires to integrate them into their workspace. If you take that idea that when working with autistic people, they may come from a theoretically different culture, even if they're also an Atlanta Braves fan and you both love the team and you both grew up in Marietta, Georgia, or whatever, you're different people, because that's one of the things about autism is it affects our ability to integrate social information. And that integrated social information, the social information that you integrate as a person over your life, that's your culture. That's what it is. You pick it up from the people around you, you integrate it, you include parts of it that fit, and you leave out parts that don't. And while there isn't an autistic culture, there simply isn't, because autism is a lens through which we absorb culture, and so each individual's culture is based on the culture around them. There is the idea that autistic people often exist within a variant of the culture around them. And so in a workplace, the idea then is to look at your autistic people, communicate them, be an ally, which means if someone says, I can't do this, or I need this, start from the assumption that that is 100% true. When someone in a wheelchair says, I can't go there, there's only stairs to get there, you believe it because you can see the wheelchair. You know that, if there's not an elevator, a ramp, or other means of getting up there, that it's extremely difficult. When someone who's deaf tells you, well, I can't listen to this music and tell you what I think of it, it's obvious. But when it's someone autistic, it becomes very difficult. You look at me. I'm talking to you fairly well. If I met most of you in a social context, you probably would not guess I'm autistic. 3 times I attempted to go to college and dropped out within the first year, because I could not handle the structured environment of the classroom and the schedule. It created so much anxiety within myself that I ended up locking myself in my house, hiding out, eventually not paying bills, having the power turned off. I lost all of the teeth in the top of my mouth because I couldn't handle the structure of basic dental hygiene on a regular basis. I sound fine, but even now I struggle with basic upkeep and maintenance of my home, with schedules, with anxiety. And I know that there are situations in which I could do things. I'm able to do this. I found a job that fits my unique challenges and skills. I can talk well. I can talk a lot. And so I found that a job like this, where I talk individually like this, it doesn't have that kind of set schedule. I have specific days where I need to be on, and then I have days where I can be off and I can recover. And so listen and believe. That's the lesson I want you to take away from here, is if you're trying to employ someone on the autism spectrum, make a starting point of they are telling you the truth. They are a person who wants to work for you. They can't work for you unless they try their best to meet your needs. So when they're telling you, I can't do this for X, or this needs to change for Y, they're doing it because they think that is the best way for them to be able to meet your needs. They have good intentions. Listen to them and believe them. Thank you so much for letting me be here and talk in front of you. And I'm really glad to have had this opportunity. Thank you.
Usbln, Business Leadership Network, driving success through disability inclusion.